Hi folks, back in the year 2000 I was given the task of selecting a new handgun for issue by my police department. What I found with that experience is it was very educational because when you pick a handgun for issue to a number of people with varying degrees of familiarity with different types of firearms designs, varying degrees of skill with regard to firearms, you have to make a lot of compromises. What you end up doing is picking the best possible firearm you can for the entire group, not necessarily what would be the best firearm for you as an individual. Back around that time, there were a number of things that I was looking at for a general issue firearm for our department. We were looking at replacing our aging 9mm semi-autos. Now, at that time, we did at least have most of the department that was familiar with semi-automatic pistols, so it wasn't like when we made the transition from revolvers to semi-autos. But still, we did not have everyone who was an expert with regard to handling, loading, cycling, etc. semi-auto firearms. What I eventually settled on was Smith&Wesson's then new SW99 pistol. For those of you that are not familiar with this pistol, it was a collaboration between Smith&Wesson in Springfield, Massachusetts, and Walther in Germany. Basically, Walther makes the entire bottom half of this pistol, and the overall design is very similar to the Walther P99. Smith&Wesson makes, or maybe I should say made, the entire top half of the pistol. And it was marketed through Smith&Wesson's distribution network, and it was also branded as a Smith&Wesson product. The SW99 had several features which at the time were fairly unique, and I'll go over those one at a time. Most noticeable of the SW99's features was an interchangeable backstrap. This was unique at the time, and this was the only semi-auto really offered back then that would allow the contour of the grip to be customized to the shooter. It had three back straps that it came with, a small, medium, and a large. And again, generally speaking, when you got a semi-auto handgun, and even still today, you get whatever grip contour the factory decides to put on that particular firearm. Nowadays, we do have a little bit more latitude with the M&P series from Smith&Wesson, and I believe even Glock now is making an interchangeable backstrap for their pistols. But back in 2000, this was the only firearm that really had that. And again, when you're looking at arming a group of individuals with different size hands, some people's hands will fit a little better around a large grip frame for a double stack magazine. Some people's hands don't fit as well. So at least this gave us a little bit of customization from shooter to shooter to try to get that firearm to fit them a little bit better. The SW99 came with 3-dot night sights, and as you can see, the night sights at this point are pretty much dead. This pistol is now about 14 years old, and the night sights have pretty well gone out over the years. They would be easy enough to replace, but at the time, we did get the night sights. The SW99's rear sight is also adjustable for windage. Now, unfortunately, for elevation, the only way you can change or adjust the sights is to either get a different ammunition that shoots to a higher or lower point of aim, or you have to completely switch out the front sight to adjust your elevation. You'll also notice at the back of the slide, you can see the rear of the striker protruding. This acts as both a cocked action indicator, and also, if you're in the dark, it gives you a tactile way to tell whether or not your firearm is in a cocked position. And I'll go over the trigger modes here shortly. The SW99 also had front cocking grooves. It had a 12-shot magazine with one in the chamber. That gave you 13 rounds that you were carrying in your holster. It has a polymer frame, and it has a decocker on the top of the frame. The SW99 also has a loaded chamber indicator, but I've got to say it's not one of the better ones I've ever seen. Right there at the very back of the extractor, when there is when there is a round loaded in the chamber, you can see that red portion of paint that's exposed. When the chamber is unloaded, that's not there. It is very difficult to see. It is almost non-functional as far as I'm concerned as a loaded chamber indicator, and there's absolutely no tactile way to know whether or not you have a round in the chamber. Here is the difference with the chamber unloaded, and again, when it is unloaded, you can't see the red paint at all at the back of the extractor. The bottom forward portion of the frame on the SW99 has a utility rail for flashlights or lasers or what have you. Unfortunately, it's a proprietary utility rail, so unlike a 1913 Picatinny, this had to have attachments that were made just for this pistol. I do believe it's the same as other Smith&Wesson pistols of the past, third generation pistols, etc. But it is a proprietary rail. It's not. This brings us to the trigger system of the SW99. And the trigger system, I believe, even to this day, is still unique. It has 3 different firing modes. And again, keep in mind this is a striker-fired pistol. It's not a hammer-fired pistol. The first firing mode is what would essentially be a double-action trigger pull. In that trigger mode, pulling the trigger all the way through its cycle, and again, if we watch the striker back here, we can see it come back, and then release. So you have your standard double-action, long, revolver-like trigger pull for the very first shot. After that, much like other traditional double-action semi-autos, the hammer stays cocked and your successive shots are fired in a single-action mode unless or until you actuate the slide-mounted decocker, which puts it back into the double-action mode. The final trigger mode is actuated when you first load the pistol and you cycle the slide. If you now apply a slight amount of pressure to the trigger, it pre-cocks the trigger. You now have essentially your single action trigger pull with a long take up. As I said, this is the only firearm I know of, the only handgun that has 3 different trigger modes. The way we always carried it was in the double action mode for the first shot, so you would have the long heavy first shot, the pistol would cycle, and then you would have your single action shots from there on. If for some reason you didn't want to deal with that long heavy double action trigger, you could preset it the way I showed a little while ago and have essentially a single action trigger with a long take up. The SW99 was a relatively short-lived duty pistol for us. We carried them from 2000 until 2007, and at that time we replaced them with the new, at that time, new Smith&Wesson M&P series, which is what we carry to this day. These were not bad pistols. When we very first purchased them, there was a problem with the original magazines. Smith&Wesson replaced all of our magazines, and from that point forward, they were very reliable pistols. They are very accurate pistols. The ergonomics are pretty good. Once you get the back strap that fits your hand well, I always liked the way these felt. The magazine release is a little different than what you usually encounter. Instead of the ubiquitous button, the SW99 has an ambidextrous lever at the back of the trigger guard, and by depressing that, you drop the magazine. The thing I always liked with it is instead of having to rotate the pistol in my hand to push the button, I was able to actuate the magazine release with my ring finger on this hand. So Smith&Wesson did offer different models or various models for the SW99 during the time of its production. It was manufactured in both 9mm and 40, also a 45 variant. They had the full-size SW99s, and they had a compact version that had all of the same features except it doesn't have the utility rail at the front. In the law enforcement market, the SW99 was basically a stopgap product between the Sigma series pistols that were never really accepted very well by law enforcement agencies and the M&P pistols that came later. The M&P pistols, I believe, are a better firearm, but the SW99s were not bad either. I don't think they ever quite got the recognition they deserved. They were an interesting product. If you find one on the used market and you feel like giving it a try, I don't think you'll be disappointed.